A quick overview of where we are. We're starting week 4. We have this week and next prior to the midterm. And just want to give you an overview of sort of where we're going in the next 4 class sessions, so you have a sense about what's going to be required of you up till the midterm, which will be assigned a week from this Thursday. What we'll do this week, one of the things that we've been doing is looking at the multiplicity of media forms for talking about the Holocaust and trying to understand, come to terms with, represent a historical event that is obviously extremely complex, but also has many different perspectives, and those perspectives are largely generated by who the person was who was involved or is talking about that event. The first week we looked at Nazi propaganda films, The Eternal Jew. Second week we looked at memoirs written by survivors themselves, particularly Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel. The third week we turned to perpetrators, and so a different perspective, obviously, than that of the victims, although ostensibly talking about, in some very significant ways, the same historical events. And we looked primarily through the media of film as well as photography. So this week we're turning to yet another medium, and in this case it's not film or photography or memoirs or historical documents, but it's poetry. And we'll spend 2 days, today and Thursday, talking about who I consider and many others consider to be 4 of the most important poets to have written about the Holocaust. The names may not be entirely familiar to you, and I think that hopefully after these lectures they will be familiar to you. But they're very significant poets who had, each one had a different experience with some facet of the Holocaust, and who tried to articulate that experience through the medium of poetry. So we'll be looking at the 4 poets, Paul Celan, Abraham Sutzkever, Nelly Sachs, and Jacob Glotstein today. I'll probably focus particularly on Celan, Sutzkever, and Sachs. And I had mentioned in an email just which poems I would focus on. I'll probably stick to that. There'll be a single lecture on a single poem next Thursday. That may sound odd to talk about a single poem for 75 minutes, but it's Death Fugue. Paul Celan's poem is probably the most important poem to ever be written about the Holocaust. And it was also a poem that was conceived in 1944, 1945, towards the very end of the Holocaust, and which has had a tremendous amount of resonance throughout Europe and especially throughout Germany in coming to terms with and trying to understand the Holocaust. So Death Fugue in many ways stands as, in some, I think, very significant way, probably the most important and, in many ways, the most complicated meditation on the significance of the Holocaust and the kind of brutality, the brutal violence, and the question of whether that brutal violence can be translated or talked about in an artistic, aesthetic genre like poetry. So that'll be our lecture for Thursday. Next week, just to give you just an update about where we're going in terms of things leading up to the midterm, there'll be just one additional poem that I'll talk about next week by Abraham Sutzkever called The Lead Plates of the Rome Printers. But I'll be talking about this not as much in terms of analyzing aesthetic forms as about talking about questions of resistance and righteousness, which is a theme that I wanted to turn to in the middle of the course because it's a theme that bespeaks a very, I think, kind of nagging question about this class, about people who did good things. Basically, people who weren't perpetrators or victims necessarily, but people who stood up, people who resisted, people who fought back, and particularly people who are not Jews themselves, who engaged in acts of righteousness which saved many lives. So we'll talk about a series of people, and their names are here, particularly Ona Shamate, Irina Sendler, and several others who I'll mention to you in lecture on Tuesday. Finally, I want to put the Holocaust back into a historical perspective and return to Samantha Power's book next Thursday. And we'll look particularly, I'll have you look at the chapter on the Cambodian genocide. And one of the things we'll do there is also look at Paul Celan's Bremen's speech, a speech that he gave after he won a number of literary prizes in Germany for his poetry, and just talking here very broadly about the implications of the Holocaust for generations to follow. That is, what do we learn? What kind of lessons do we take from this? What's the question about the kind of burden of memory or our responsibility as ethical citizens to understanding and relating to and coming to terms with the past? Also, how we understand that in a comparative perspective. And so the Cambodian genocide will be just the one chapter from Samantha Power that we'll look at. That will be the last thing that you'll be responsible for, by the way, for the midterm. You can certainly expect something relating to Samantha Power's book to be on the midterm, as well as any of the material that we talked about up through week 5. So whether it's films, historical documents, memoirs, poetry, what have you, all fair game. Anything that I had talked about in lecture would be where I would put your focus on in terms of review. The midterm itself, I haven't written it yet, but it will be a take-home exam, which means it's an open book, open note exam, and it's obviously you can talk to people in the class as well. When you turn in the exam, it's very important that you actually do your own writing. You will turn it in via Turnitin in the same way you are doing for your response papers. And one of the things that Turnitin does, besides look for if you grab material from, say, a website that you didn't accurately cite, which now we know not to do, and hopefully you've always known that, but it's just been reinforced. It also compares the papers that your peers turn in. So if, for example, 2 people write the exact same thing, this would reflect very detrimentally on your grade. So please, one of the things I do want to emphasize, as much as I am all for collaboration and for talking to and a kind of participatory knowledge, I'm all for these things. I have a sort of Web 2.0 outlook about lots of my life, and so I'm all for participation. However, it's important that every person is actually doing his or her part and not stealing from someone else. So it is important that for the midterm, especially because it's open book, and also for your response papers, that you are turning in your own work. We've also had a problem already identified through Turnitin of people turning in the same work. So I'm saying this to you now. Last time I said it was a question of plagiarism. Now it's a question of people turning in the same thing. You do want to be very careful to be sure that your own work is what you're accurately representing. One last note about Turnitin. If you have not posted your first 2 response papers and your third one through Turnitin, I changed the dates just to give you a little extra time because some people may have missed the deadline. Your papers won't be graded until you do it. So it's basically, if you don't turn it in, it's a 0 for the papers. So we have, I think, a significant number of people who have, but I'd say there's at least 60 people in the class who haven't. So if that's you, you can still turn it in up through Friday. Otherwise, papers get 0 grades. Questions? Yep. That's for everything. Yep. So you can, and retrospectively for the first 2. Okay? So, yeah. Any case, so there's up to the midterm. I'm going to go ahead and turn to lecture today. And I'm going to be talking about 4 poets and then talking a little bit about poetry analysis. I know that poetry gives people anxieties, mainly because it's so difficult to grasp and understand and unpack. And hopefully after lecture today, you'll have a little bit more sense about how you might find in ways in terms of interpreting these poems and also trying to understand the historical and, I think, aesthetic significance of these poems. That is, how they embody through language and prose and imagery and symbolism something that gives us a lesson about the relationship to the Holocaust or the experiences the poet is trying to convey. So the 4 poets, and hopefully you had a chance to read this. I think that's pretty clear. The 4 poets are Paul Celan, Nelly Sachs, Abraham Sutzkever, and Jacob Glattstein. Just a brief introduction, and if you read this already, hopefully you know most of this. 2 of these poets are writing in German. One is writing in Yiddish. Gladstein actually wrote in multiple languages, but it's important to first of all recognize that a decision right away to write poems in German is a very interesting decision, particularly by Paul Celan and Nelly Sachs, because German represented already the language of the perpetrators. When you think about the German, and maybe you might think back to the Wannsee Conference or the protocols we've read, or even some of the German language we've talked about. The German language was something that many people saw, particularly the victims, they saw it to be something of the language of the bureaucracy of the Holocaust. It was mechanical, it was cold, it was callous, it was violent, it was brutal. You can even think about the way the words sounded to be spoken about as a piece, right? A shtuk, as opposed to a human being. To have heard all the yelling of the capo, of the camp commandants, about roll call, all of the things that Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi talked about in terms of just listening to German. German sounds very harsh, very cold, very calculating, very brutal. And so you already have this interesting question as to why someone like Celan or Sachs would write in German. And if anything, the language of the victims is a different language. It's probably Yiddish, possibly Polish, possibly Romanian, possibly Russian. The language of the victim, maybe Italian, maybe French. Certainly there are plenty of victims, German victims, but the vast majority were Yiddish speaking. And so this is actually an interesting question for us because for Celan and Sachs, neither of whom, for Celan at least, neither of whom had German as their primary language. Sachs actually did, sorry. Sachs had German as their primary language, but Celan did not. He was making a very conscious decision to try to reclaim something of a history that he thought had been lost. So Celan himself was born in an area called Bukovina. It doesn't exist anymore. Like so many places and towns of the Holocaust, they've been wiped off the map. A significant part of what Paul Celan was trying to do in his poetry was to find out where he came from, to understand his past, and to try to find points of orientation, to basically mark time and space, to try to say, hey, something happened at this place at this time, and it's important. One of the things that so many of these poets do is refer to places and times. They try to locate things in the past and try to say, it's here that this happened. Why does Abraham Sutzkever, for example, he dates his poems, not only does he say it happened on this date in 1943, he says where it happened, in the Vilna ghetto, because he's trying to locate his language and his experience in a particular time-space coordinate. And that time-space coordinate is often very foreign to us because it's not where we live, it's not our time, it's not our place. And so one thing that these poems are trying to do is to try to express something from the past, a geographic and a historical location. Celan was always very concerned with the loss of place, the kind of placelessness, the kind of anonymity, the kind of the grass growing over where the death camps used to be. He was born in 1920. He died in 1970. He died by suicide. A number of other major Holocaust survivors also killed themselves. Primo Levi being, I don't think I mentioned that, being another. The experience of having survived the Holocaust was in some ways so overwhelming and so difficult that I think many victims who did survive were still struggling many years later to understand, to come to terms with the losses that they suffered. Celan killed himself in 1970 after having suffered many bouts of depression, and prior to that having written about 800 poems, almost all of which in various ways approach the Holocaust or come to terms with his own personal loss. He lost both of his parents in the Holocaust. They were both killed anonymously. He doesn't know where they were buried. He doesn't know where they ended up. They were killed in the snows somewhere in the Ukraine. They were probably shot, most likely by Einsatzkommandos. He himself served 19 months in a slave labor camp. So he worked in one of these camps. He was, because of his age, was selected to work. He was relatively fit at the time. He was considered to be, fit enough to do slave labor. It happened to be that he was in Berlin during Kristallnacht in 1938 when he saw, at a very young age, at the age of 18, when he was getting ready to go to medical school, he saw the destruction that was about to happen, or that was already happening. Kristallnacht, as you may know, it's the night of broken glass, was a massive riot orchestrated by the Nazis, particularly by the SA, throughout Germany to destroy synagogues, Jewish businesses, households, and round up Jews, which was essentially the very first organized measure to terrorize the Jewish population in Germany. About 30,000 Jews were sent to concentration camps in 1938. And this is, again, prior to the beginnings of the war. It's essentially prior to that period that we understand to be the Holocaust. Celan was a witness to this, and he was a witness to the impending doom and destruction that was about to envelop all of Europe. So in 1941, he and his family were arrested. They were sent to forced labor camps. He was separated from his parents. He knows from a letter that his mother sent him when his father died. In fact, it's the topic of one of the poems that you read for us today. He also knows that approximately when his mother died, but he doesn't know where they're buried, doesn't know anything about what happened to them. His most famous poem, the one I'll talk about on Thursday, is called Death Fugue. And it's an amazing elegy about a relationship between a perpetrator and a victim. And in many ways, it's also a citation of a kind of large cultural history of sort of where Germany came from. I mean, the most famous person who ever composed fugues, which are particular music compositions, was Bach. And we'll listen to a real fugue on Thursday and try to understand a musical fugue in relationship to a literary fugue, to sort of understand what Celan was thinking about as he composed this poem, this extraordinary poem. In any case, let me talk just briefly about the other three poets. Nelly Sachs, she was the only born German, raised in Berlin, and she was, as many were at this period, Germany epitomized the language and the place of culture and training. Many people, even like Celan, although he didn't speak German as a native language, he learned German in school because that was the language of culture and philosophy and music. They learned German because it was basically it stood for higher education. In many ways, the way that English today, I think, has become somewhat more of a universal language, German was that in the 1920s. German, especially for Europeans very broadly, German was the language of culture and education, and most people learned German even if it wasn't their native language. Sachs herself was born in Germany. She studied theater, literature, dance, music, and she successfully was able to escape Nazi Germany in 1940 because she managed to secure the backing of someone, a Swedish author, who managed to get her papers that allowed her to immigrate really at the last moment from Germany, where she probably, had she stayed, would have been deported and possibly killed. She began writing poetry almost immediately about the destruction of European Jewry, and her poems were published immediately after the war. She became extremely well-known and respected, and in fact won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and that was in 1966. Abraham Sutzkever presents us with another kind of view or another experience. He was born in a small town outside of Vilna, which is now part of Lithuania. This is located in the eastern part, in between Poland and the Russian Empire. And he studied Yiddish and Hebrew. His first language was Yiddish, and he had worked during the war. He was someone who worked in the resistance movement and the underground around Vilna, which is something I'll talk about next week more extensively, in order to fight and to begin to undermine German troops and also the advancing German army. So he had organized a Jewish resistance group where he fought underground. He managed to escape and survive after the war, largely by hiding in the forests and behind the enemy lines. He's someone that's I think at any moment may have been captured and could have been killed, but in fact, through a certain amount of chance and a certain amount of skill, managed to survive. And most of his poetry talks about experiences that he saw, things that were seen firsthand, like mass graves, mass shootings of Jews outside of the city of Vilna, as well as just corpses, the experiences of just seeing and trying to understand just the stuff that, the stuff of nightmares. Finally, Jacob Glotstein is, who I may or may not get to today, but offers a different perspective entirely, because he had managed to leave Poland in 1934 and actually settled in the United States. He went back briefly to visit in Poland during the rise of Nazism in its early years, and most of his poems are written from the perspective of distance. That is to say, not things suffered or experienced firsthand, but things seen from a distance, and trying to understand the kind of obligation that he, as someone who survived and someone who was safe, what kind of obligations he has. So it's a different perspective than someone like Sutskever, who was basically in hiding the entire time during the war, actively working for the Jewish underground resistance against the Nazis, who had been in the ghetto in Vilna, who had narrowly escaped to being killed himself, or the case of Ceylon, someone who was in a slave labor camp and who, for 19 months, toiled away in a factory. So that's our background for the four poets. And now we're going to turn a little bit to trying to understand poetry and look at some of the poems themselves. Let's see. So, I will... Oops. Let's go through that. Where are we here? So I think, by the way, I uploaded the... I uploaded the first 6 lectures of the PowerPoint to the CCLE website, and so every Thursday after lecture I'll do that, so that if you want to review the slides, they're all available there, and basically after every week they'll be there for you. They're also featured in the videos if you want to watch those. So, poetry analysis. I realize poems present people with a lot of anxiety. This is the week that we actually have the least amount of readings, but in some ways they're the most difficult. So there may only have been 10 pages of reading, so to speak, but those 10 pages can be extremely hermetic, very difficult to unpack and to understand. And so I wanted to give you some questions that I thought would be useful for just beginning our poetry analysis. And these questions will sort of inform the analysis of some of the poems that I'll go over in the next hour or so. First question, and this is, I think, sort of somewhat obvious, but perhaps demands some special attention from us, is what do we know about the historical context? I mean, most of these poems have a place and a date associated with them. And so as soon as we see Vilna 1943, my sense is we look up Vilna 1943. That might just be going to Google. It might be going to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial website. It might be trying to understand, what is this place? Why was it significant? And what was going on in 1943? What was going on in 1944 or 45? What was going on in the context of the poet's life that gave rise to this poem? Is this poem an eyewitness kind of report? Or is this a poem composed after the fact in which maybe certain kind of a different sort of perspective or a different kind of understanding informed what the poet's talking about? Some poems were written in the moment or shortly afterwards. Some poems were written many years afterwards, and they reflect back on something. The memoirs that we read from Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi, although written fairly close to the moment in which they happened, were still written with a certain amount of perspective. And that perspective allows a different kind of understanding than something in the moment. What about the language in which the poem is written? The significance of German versus Yiddish, the significance of certain German words. Now, granted, you may not know any German whatsoever. However, I'll isolate a few important words today, and we'll begin to understand how Ceylon particularly is trying to take the language of the perpetrators and turn it into something that also gives voice to the victims. Titles. Titles of poems convey a lot. In many ways, you can unpack so much, especially in the context of this class, because we've already put together, I think, a very solid historical basis for understanding a lot about the Holocaust. What does the title convey? How does it begin? What are the significance of those particular words? If you just even were to start with a poem like Nearness of Graves, already a title like this in 1943 should tell us a lot. You might remember, and just to kind of give you an insight as to how to do this, we spoke a lot about the anonymity of mass death. We spoke a lot about the ways in which one of the major factors of dehumanization during the Holocaust was the fact that people were killed in mass. You no longer have single individuals with individual graves where people say Kaddish or come to the bedside of the dying or the dead, but instead you have multitudes of people killed anonymously in pits. To talk about nearness of graves for Paul Celan has a sort of irony in the sense that the graves didn't exist if we're talking about individual people who have grave markers that says you live from this time to this time, so-and-so was a doctor or a lawyer, so-and-so was born here and died there. Nearness of graves is precisely what the victims never had. They never had this kind of closeness of being able to have an authentic individual death. And so already Celan is beginning to think about, in 1943, at the height of the Holocaust, what's at stake when death and dying is essentially robbed. That death, and one's own death, is taken away from the victims. It's something that Levy talked about, something that Wiesel talks about, something that Celan talks about. It's something that is absolutely critical for understanding the Holocaust. It's not just that there was death, but there was this anonymous mass death which was fundamentally dehumanizing. So what about the overall tone or feeling of the poem? Can you read it out loud? Can you get a sense about how the poem moves? Does it have a certain structure, a certain rhythm, a certain cadence? Does it repeat certain words? Is there a kind of repetition that's informing the meaning of the poem? Is it structured in, how is it structured? Is it rhyming? Is it not rhyming? Is it a free form? How is it laid out on the page? Is there a quotation in the middle of the poem? Is it short, stubby sentences? Is it long? One can begin to understand something about the basic structure of the poem that may tell us something about its meaning. Then, of course, there's this question of references. What kind of references are in the poem? Are they references to history, to geography, to places, to culture, to religion? Do you know who these people are that are being cited? If not, Google. What's a hetman? Who's Yaakov? Who's Margareta? Who's Sulamit? All of these questions which are in these poems, I think very easily you begin to kind of understand and build up a context as soon as you find out who these references are. The question of audience. I mean, who the poet is addressing. This is, I think, a really significant question because oftentimes there's this question of a you in a poem. Is it you meaning like us? Is it you meaning his mother? Is it you meaning the perpetrators? Who is this you in a poem? Is the poem in dialogue with someone else? Is the poem this? It's not just that you have a poem as this thing in a vacuum, but a poem is not only written in a context, but it's attempting to reach out to a certain context. And that's important, trying to understand, if you can at all, the audience for a poem. So when Nellie Sachs says, you, the onlookers, she's directing it to someone. She's actually saying, hey, this poem is about you, those bystanders who stood by and didn't do anything when they came and took away your neighbors. You, the onlookers, this poem is about you. I'm pointing my finger at you, right? It's different than Celan writing a poem to his mother. He's not pointing a finger at her, but he's basically trying to imagine giving her a message, telling her something that he can't possibly tell her because she's either somewhere in a work camp in the winter in the middle of the slopes in the Ukraine, or she's dead, right? So this you here is trying to convey a message. Again, the audience and the address of these poems, I think, is absolutely critical. They don't exist in vacuums. They're not sort of hermetic things that sort of stand by themselves, but they reach out. They reach through time and place in some way. So what about the imagery in the poem? Obviously, poems like this have imagery that sort of moves between metaphorical language and real experienced things. When Sutskever talks about frozen Jews, the question is he speaking metaphorically here, like that the Jews were cold and there were frozen Jews, or is he actually talking about something that he saw with his own eyes, Jews lined row upon row, frozen on the ground? And it's a question that we may not ultimately be able to answer, right? We can't ask him, Sutskever, did you actually see this? But we have to, at least in our mind, try to think, is he speaking metaphorically here, or is he speaking about real experiences? And so much as the basis for Holocaust poetry is about real experiences, right? These are not experiences that were made up, that were invented, that were fabled. You're not talking about some kind of hypothetical hell. They're talking about a real hell that was really experienced. And so here we have to try to understand the historical realities that are built into a poem, and the fact that so much of this poetry is not metaphorical at all. In fact, Celan one time said that he never writes metaphors. None of his poems are metaphorical. They're all real. That's interesting, because so much of what we think about with poetry is always metaphorical language. This stands for that, it's symbolic of something else, or this wasn't really experienced. Celan's saying, no, this is pretty much all real. What I'm basically doing is taking the form of poem to tell you about history, to tell you about real things that people went through. Is the poem telling a story, presenting a particular image or an event? Same thing. Again, it comes back to that issue of the historical reality underpinning so much of this poetry. Can we begin to parse these individual words and phrases? Can you make associations based on things you've already read through other authors or films you've seen? As you make these associations, I think a web of associations will help us to understand the significance of these poems. And finally, this question about what's unique about Holocaust poetry. It's kind of an odd thing to talk about Holocaust poetry. In some ways, it's the same way to talk about Holocaust art. Because usually when we think about poetry and art, these are things that we reserve for, they're things that we reserve for the things that make us the most human and cultured. And now you're talking about something which is so brutal and dehumanizing and taking away of culture. And so bringing these two things together, Holocaust poetry or Holocaust art, already there's kind of almost a paradox at the heart here. It's not to say that you can't have poetry about the Holocaust. Of course you can. Just like you can have art about the Holocaust. And there was art made during the Holocaust. That people wrote poems during the Holocaust. They created works of art. They created music. They wrote recipes. All the things that kind of are about our humanity. These things continued to be made during the Holocaust and afterwards. But what does it mean to take the Holocaust as your subject, right? Something so horrific like that. I guess it's a similar question about what does it mean to take war as your subject, or genocide, or something absolutely brutal. So it's not really only about what's most sublime or esteemed or something maybe most beautiful, but it could also be something which is absolutely horrific. And that could also be the subject and almost the motivation for why you write poems or create art. It could also be a way of coping. It could be a way of coming to terms. It could be a way of communicating. Insofar as Levi talked about, the dream, the nightmare that he had, you might remember, is the unlistened to story. I imagine the nightmare that Celan or someone else would have would be the unlistened to poem, the one that never got heard or understood. And so there, the demand is placed upon us as listeners or viewers to relate to these experiences that are fundamentally foreign to our own. Okay, so let's take a couple of poems to start with, and I'm going to begin with Celan, and start with Nearness of Graves. I'll read the poem to you. If you have in the course reader, you can obviously make notes. You have also the German in many of these side by side. You're not, of course, required to read the German. If you happen to know German, I think it adds another layer of meaning to your understanding. So, Nearness of Graves, 1943. Still do the southerly bug waters know, mother, the waves whose blows wounded you so. Still does the field with whose windmills remember how gently your heart to its angels surrendered. Can none of the aspens and none of the willows allow you their solace, remove all your sorrows? And does not the God with his blossoming wand go up in the hills climbing hither and yon? And can you, mother, as once on a time, can you bear, mother, as once on a time, the gentle, the German, the pain-laden rhyme? So, in terms of understanding this, if we just take some of our analytic things that we just talked about here, I mentioned to spend some time on the title, The Nearness of Graves. Perhaps the kind of irony about talking about graves would be maybe my starting point. The very fact that he's talking about an experience here clearly about his mother who was killed anonymously somewhere on the slopes of the Ukraine. There's geographic references here in this poem. They're references that begin to locate a time and a space. I think you can even start from just nearness, the closeness of graves, the closeness of a place. The southerly bug waters, a geographic reference to a river, a place that's perhaps far away. A field right here, windmills on the field, aspens, willows, nature, hills. There's a whole landscape in this poem that Celan is beginning to evoke. And it's a landscape that's importantly one where his mother died and one which he himself is not at. There's a kind of estrangement in the poem, right, between his experience as someone who at this moment is still living and the fact that his mother is probably not. There's an estrangement between the poet and the person he's attempting to communicate with. And that estrangement is partially topographic in the sense that there's this anonymous field, a place where the bug waters flow, aspens, willows, a field, all these things that kind of call up a place where his mom was taken when she was deported. It's called graves, so already we know that something already about death is important here. We also have this question at the end here. A number of questions. The poem, in fact, is punctuated by questions. Every other line is a question. I would ask, why? Why is he asking these questions? Who are they directed towards? At one point, clearly the question is directed to his mom. He asks her, mother, can you, as in once upon a time, can you tolerate, can you bear the gentle, the German, the pain-laden rhyme? The very fact that he's writing a poem to commemorate this moment of his mom's death in German. Can you bear the German words that I'm using to talk about the death, your death? Essentially, the poem in some ways becomes the mother's grave. This is the marker of someone who is killed anonymously. He essentially is trying to come up with a way, and in this case through the German language, of giving her, in some sense, a proper burial. He talks about how she died, right? How gently your heart to its angels surrendered. Can none of the aspens and none of the willows allow you their solace, remove all your sorrows? The suffering that she probably went through, but suffering that he didn't experience because he was already estranged from his mom. A sense of anonymity. He asks, still does the field with whose windmills remember? It's interesting, right? It's not so much that people are doing the remembering, it's that the landscape is doing the remembering. The windmills, those things that are there in the kind of anonymous topography, those are the things that are remembering. Those are the witnesses who saw what happened. Those are the things that are still there. So it's the windmills that are doing the remembering. This kind of amazing anonymous landscape, which now is also given the burden of having to remember his mom's life and her death. And then Celan trying to articulate this in a poem, and doing so in German, and wondering if that's going to cause her even more pain. Other thoughts? Things we may have left out? Things we could add to this analysis? Yeah? In German, it's always uppercase in German because it's a noun. The translation made it lowercase. I don't think there's any significance about whether it's uppercase or lowercase there. Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, that's true. And exactly. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, in German, it's Gott, G-O-T-T. It's capitalized. It may or may not be. It's a general term, which may or may not refer to a Jewish God. It could refer to, any God. Sure. I mean, it's. I think you probably could do an interpretation like that, and even bring in, Elie Wiesel and the kind of the massive loss of faith that he went through. I think that certainly there's other Ceylon poems that would bear out that argument. Yeah, I think it's a little hard to press on exactly what he means here by the God, but I think you're right. It's not exactly clear if this is a Jewish God. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. This is a question, by the way, about the landscape. It's something which is going to be so utterly important when you go back. Even that clip I showed you from Night and Fog, where they take the film camera and they go back to those places where things happen. When we watch sections from Claude Lanzmann's film Shoah in a couple of weeks, the landscape is very important. He goes back to those places where things happen. He goes back to Chelmno and Belzec and Treblinka and Auschwitz. He takes his camera there and he looks at the grass that's been growing. He looks at the remains of the barracks and the places where people were. And it's, many years later. It may be 5 years, 10 years, 20, 30 years later. In the case of Lanzmann, it's more like 30 years later. And the only real authentic memory of what happened there are by these things that are inanimate, right? It's essentially, or things like grass, right? The trees, the windmills. Those are the things that were there that saw what happened, but those things don't speak, right? I mean, after all, windmills really don't remember. And so trying to imagine the windmill, the landscape being the memory, is a very interesting way of thinking that, only human beings really are the ones who remember, but yet the real witnesses that saw everything were things like the trees. Okay, let's move on. So this is Black Flakes. I won't have as much time because I want to make sure we get to a number of the poems today to go into a lot of detail here, but I do want to talk about this one, 1943 as well. Again, the title is already going to convey something to us that I think is significant. I mean, this is the same thing for Death Fugue. I mean, Paul Celan's poems often bring together oppositional or seemingly dichotomous things. So to call it a death fugue or black flakes. I mean, flakes in this case, if you're talking about, you may be talking about snowflakes perhaps, they're generally not black. If you're talking about black flakes, maybe you're talking about things that are charred or burned or burning. And so clearly references here to the historical reality of annihilation and the crematoria, I think are very well situated. And yet it starts with snow. So Black Flake starts with snow. And I think that's already interesting, right? You already have this kind of dichotomous beginning. Snow has fallen with no light. A month has gone by now or two since autumn in its monkish cowl brought tidings my way, a leaf from Ukrainian slopes. This is a letter. A letter is a leaf here. Quote, remember, it's wintry here too for the thousandth time now, in the land where the broadest torrent flows, Yaakov's heavenly blood blessed by axes. O ice of unearthly red, their hetman wades with all his troops into darkening suns. Oh, for a cloth, child, to wrap myself when it's flashing with helmets. When the rosy flow bursts, when snowdrift sifts your father's bones, hooves crushing, the song of the cedar, a shawl, just a thin little shawl, so I keep by my side. Now you're learning to weep, this anguish, this world that will never turn green, my child, for you, for your child. Autumn bled all away, mother. Snow burned me through. I sought out my heart so it might weep. I found, oh, the summer's breath. It was like you. Then came my tears. I wove the shawl. So in terms of just structure here, I mean, one had to talk about the differences between these three parts, right? I mean, at some point, this doesn't have the same kind of unity as this poem here does. right? This poem has those questions that come every other line. It's a rhyming kind of couplet. I think it's a single unified thing. Whereas this poem begins with one image of receiving, in this case, a leaf from Ukrainian slopes. In German, it's ein Blatt, which means basically a letter that he received. Where did it come from? It came from the Ukraine. What are the Ukrainian slopes? Again, that topography, this kind of anonymous topography of having received a letter. In this case, it's a letter from his mother. You notice this part's in quotes. It becomes kind of clear that it's a letter from his mother because of the last part down here, and where she talks about something that happened to his father. When snowdrift sifts your father's bones, hooves crushing. The reality is that his father had already been killed. His mom was aware of that. Basically, this is a letter that Ceylon had received from his mother telling him that his father was dead. It may not have been this exact letter. She may not have written it in this way. My sense is he received a letter, and this is Ceylon reworking it into his own kind of poetic meaning, his own way of understanding his relationship, his feelings, his anguish, his hurt, his hopes, the sense of loss, all of these things being reworked, almost like he's taking the letter that he received and he's talking about how he personally perceived it. And then you return in the bottom here, this other thing, the sense of change, right? So snow has fallen, it's autumn. Autumn has bled away, so some sense of time has passed, right? Some sense of things that have happened in between. He gets this word, finds out his father's dead. His mother's still who knows where. It ends with him weaving a shawl. I wove the shawl, supposedly Ceylon, meaning he wove the shawl for his mother who is there shivering, cold, right, in some kind of wintry landscape. So that would help us to begin to understand this poem. We begin to unpack this kind of historical reality. We begin to unpack a little bit about the references. What are other things we can add to our analysis of this? I mean, what else might you say? I mean, this is certainly a more difficult poem than the first one. I realize that, it takes, again, a certain amount of, it takes a lot of effort, quite honestly, to begin to unpack these poems, which in many ways are kind of almost like little crystals, right? They're reduced essences of a whole bunch of historical experiences and feelings. But what else might we say? I mean, is there anything else that strikes you as noteworthy about this in terms of interpreting it? Right. I mean, it's amazing. This is an interesting poem that, the seasons become something that also are telling you something, right? So it's there's a lot of temporal markers here. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier that's so important about Ceylon's poems, but also Holocaust poetry, is the time and the space markings, right? And time is marked here through months. It's marked here through seasons. It's marked here through changes in knowledge about events. And it's also, space is marked, through things like Ukrainian slopes and so forth. But you have references here, snow falling, a month or two has gone by, autumn. Later down he says, it will never turn green, this world that will never turn green, meaning spring will never arrive, right? Some sense about the inevitability of death. And finally, he talks about a summer's breath, some sense about where he was still healthy, where still alive. So some sense about being almost, I wouldn't call it quite inevitability, but a kind of foreclosed, a destruction which I think was pretty much known at this time. Anything else? Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, I think it's interesting. One reference here, and I think this, the main reference to clothing is certainly the shawl. Right? The shawl being something that you wrap yourself in, a shawl providing warmth and comfort and nurturing. Remember, again, all that I had talked about with regard to Elie Wiesel, the transvaluation of material objects, like little things like spoons and bowls, and in this case maybe a shawl, gaining a significant amount of value during the experience of the Holocaust, because these are the things that were most connected to one's vital survival, right? The things that we take for utter granted, that don't mean anything to us because we, of course, expect that we're going to have clothes to wear. These are things that were deprived of the victims. So this sense of just tremendous amount of suffering through through malnourishment, through being not clothed properly, through having to work in icy, snowy conditions, the death march that Elie Wiesel's father was on, things like that. I mean, contrast that to this flashing helmets, right? This moment in which there's almost an insertion here of the perpetrators, right? And this motion of an earthly red, right? Of ice of earthly red, their hetman wades with all his troops into darkening suns. Oh, for a cloth, the mother cries out, to wrap myself when it's flashing with helmets, right? This sense of something's going on here that's bringing the perpetrators and the victims together. Something that the darkening sun, the troops, the hetmen, the helmets that are flashing, all these things to me signifying the perpetrators. And the one thing that the victim's looking for here is that piece of clothing to offer solace or warmth, and something that Celan, of course, couldn't provide to his mother. So the ending here of maybe a certain amount of guilt. I wove the shawl. Did he send it? Could he have sent it? Could he have given it to her? Could he have helped save his mom? Probably not. Anything else? Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. You could read these things more than one way. I think I would read it on a most literal level as just a shawl providing warmth, but you could also imagine a prayer shawl. Certainly there's a tradition of that, and often these words have many different layers of meaning. So absolutely, I would agree with that. Okay, I'm going to move on to this one. Abraham Sutzkever, two poems that I'll talk about, Burnt Pearls and Frozen Jews. Again, the date, the time is important here. This particular one, Burnt Pearls in the Vilna Ghetto, July 28, 1943. This is probably the moment in which the poem was written. It may not bear out an exact historical event, but my sense is that these are not poems that are metaphorical or imaginary or made up. And I think that's significant in a way, because in the same way that Celan talks about his poems being anti-metaphorical, I think Sutzkever is very much the same thing. These burnt pearls, I don't think that he's talking about meaning anything that symbolizes anything else. I think he's talking literally about burnt pearls. It's not just because my words quiver like broken hands grasping for aid, or that they sharpen themselves like teeth on the prowl in darkness, that you, written word, substitute for my world, flare up the coals of my anger. It's because your sounds glint like burnt pearls discovered in an extinguished pyre, and no one, not even I, shredded by time, can recognize the woman drenched in flame, for all that remains of her now are these gray pearls smoldering in the ash. I mean, it's a pretty, it's a somewhat, I mean, if you had to describe the tone here, it's a somewhat different tone, I think, than what we just read from Celan, which, I mean, I would say Celan is certainly more elegiacal, contemplative. I mean, how would you describe this? I mean, tone-wise, the feeling. I mean, what do you think? Right. I mean, it's not just because my words quiver. His words quiver. I mean, you can almost imagine someone trying to say something and that person's like shaking, right? The words are quivering. I mean, these are written words, so imagine like his pen is literally shaking as he's writing this, or trying to bear witness. Like broken hands grasping for aid, some sense that he can't even write because his hands have been broken. They sharpen themselves, the words, they're on the prowl in darkness. That the written word substitutes for my world, meaning the real historical experience he's trying to convey in a written form, and it flares up coals of my anger. There's some sense of, I think, a tremendous sense of anger here. I mean, he says as much, and I think there's a sense that this feeling here is like what you've just seen. He's just overcome by emotion, by a sense of I need to write down, I need to convey this, but I'm quivering, right? I'm shaking as I try to convey this. And what is he trying to convey? He's trying to convey that there's a woman who has been drenched in flame, probably burned, and all that remains of her are pearls, probably on a necklace that she wore. I mean, some sense of a horrific reality. And the reality here is that the Vilna ghetto, which had been in two different parts, had been evacuated in 1943. Most of the members were sent off to the forest outside of Vilna. They were shot in mass graves, and then they were burned in massive pyres and buried. So is this something that he saw, something that he experienced, something that he knew about? Most likely. I mean, the sense here is that you had literally bodies of people being burned, and they may have, in fact, even still had, necklaces on or even other kind of valuables. So smoldering in the ash. The sense is, in some sense, the poem is divided, I would say, into two parts. One is the anger, the attempt to convey this story, and the second is what he saw, the historical reality of perceiving something this horrific. Shredded by time. Such an interesting word, to be shredded by time. I don't even know quite what you mean, to be shredded by time, but understanding the kind of the exigencies of trying to convey this historical experience. Try another one. This is Moscow, July 10th, 1944. I think this is the date that the poem was written. I don't think that this date's referring to something that he saw in Moscow on July 10th, 1944. He was in Moscow at this time because he had already survived. He was behind the enemy lines. He had come to fight on the side of the Russians in terms of liberating, liberating camps as the line advanced further and further into Germany. But by this time, I believe that he's recollecting an experience. It's called Frozen Jews. It goes like this. Did you ever see in fields of snow frozen Jews in row upon row? Breathless they lie, marbled in blue, of death in their bodies no hint and no clue. Somewhere their spirit is frozen and saved, like a goldfish in a frozen wave. Not speaking, not silent, just thinking bright. The sun too lies frozen in snow at night. On a rosy lip in the freeze still glows a smile, will not move, not budge since it froze. Near his mother a baby starving at rest. How strange, she cannot give him her breast. The fist of a naked old man in surprise, he cannot release his force from the ice. So far I've tasted all kinds of death, none will surprise me, will catch my breath. But now overcome in the mid-July heat by a frost like a madness right in the street. They come toward me, blue bones in a row, frozen Jews over plains of snow. My skin is covered with a marble veil. My words slow down, my light that is frail. My motions freeze like the old man's surprise who cannot release his force from the ice. So, just starting again with structure of a poem. I mean, for one thing, start with the title. I mean, such a strange, utterly, almost obscene title. Right? Frozen Jews. I mean, this is generally not the qualifying adjective that you would place in front of the word Jews. Frozen. I mean, it's such a strange, utterly kind of alien experience to talk about people who have been frozen. Frozen. How did they become frozen? Are they outside? Had they been succumbed to a certain amount of, had they succumbed to something? What happened to them that they got to that point? Were they dead? And they were just left lying there? Frozen Jews. So an extraordinary kind of title that evokes such a strange, utterly alien experience, something that we, I don't think, have experienced. But then he has almost the audacity of sorts to write this in a rhyming couplet. A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B. Snow, row, blue, clue, saved, wave, bright, night, glows, froze, rest, breast. I mean, this is, it almost has a sort of playfulness to it. Right? I mean, can you talk about an experience as utterly horrific as really talking about people who had been frozen, who died, and whose bodies, maybe they weren't buried, maybe they froze, maybe there was something had happened to them, and they're being, and he's talking about it in a way that I think has a kind of levity to it, and a levity comes through the rhyming couplets. Now, this is not to say this is a moment of disrespect, but it is to wonder about what's going on in this poem where he could take something as horrific as people frozen to death outside and speak about them in a kind of almost playful rhyming couplet type of way. So what's he trying to do there? How would you understand this? Yeah? What do you think? Right. Good point. Mm-hmm. You almost have to take the absurdity. I agree with that entirely. I think you also take the absurdity of the situation, the extreme incomprehensibility, the fact that this is unimaginable, and you have to almost put it in a sense to kind of like underscore this absurdity. Like if you make sense of it somehow and you kind of make it palatable and understandable, in some ways I think you've transformed it from being utterly absurd and incomprehensible to being comprehensible and digestible. Like, I mean, it shouldn't in the end be digestible. We shouldn't be able to say, oh yeah, I remember that time I saw these frozen Jews and I jotted down this little ditty. That's absurd. And there's a kind of absurdity which I think is fundamental to what he was trying to do. It's almost like you pass this point, you might just say this is the point of anger and an attempt to kind of, really rise up. And at some point there's this almost point of the absurdity, the complete overwhelmingness of the situation. And almost that's reflected by the absurdity of the structure he chooses to convey it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in some ways, again, one of the things that's going on here, and there's different forms, and I guess this goes back to the broader question of the class, is invoking many different media forms to talk about a historical event, right? So, I mean, the use of film to talk about it, historical reenactments, of going back to the location, of using poetry to understand it, to looking at memoirs. Later we'll look at a graphic novel, we'll look at a novel. I mean, all these things, all ways of trying to come to terms with this complexity of a historical event, one which was significantly without precedent in terms of its scale and scope and efficiency and impact. So, good. So Nellie Sachs, this I think is the last one that I'll have time to talk about today. And there's a couple that she wrote that I included in the course reader, like Chorus of the Unborn, which I think is a really interesting poem. And there's, I think, a couple others by Sutzkever as well, and then a few by Ceylon that I won't have time to talk about, like Tenebrae, which is a really extraordinary poem, extraordinary for lots of reasons, because the theological element, which goes back to your question about God here, is in Tenebrae, it's translated, Herr is the word, which means in German not just Mr. or Master, but could also mean Lord. And so it's a kind of multivalent term in his poetry. But I'm going to end by talking about Nellie Sachs' poem, You Onlookers. And again, this goes back to one of the original questions that I had asked at the lecture of who these poems are addressed to. We could ask that about, frozen Jews. Who's this addressed to? I mean, my sense is this is addressed to people like you and I who weren't there, who would say this is a completely absurd situation and try to understand its gravity. This is probably addressed to someone, in a sense of who would share his outrage, right, of seeing such a thing. The poems of Ceylon, I think, in some ways are meditations dedicated to his mother, right? Very personal, at least these two. You, the Onlookers, is dedicated to someone else. It's dedicated to those people that Elie Wiesel mentions at the very beginning of his memoir, the people who looked out their windows as the Jews were deported on trains. It's dedicated to those people who could have intervened or possibly have protested or have done something, but who didn't. It's dedicated to perhaps the majority of people who were complicit insofar as they did nothing. And it's a strange kind of complicity, right? I mean, it's a very strange kind of complicity, because usually someone's guilty of something because of their actions. In this case, she's talking about people who are guilty of something because of their inaction. They had the knowledge, they had the possibility of doing something which may have in fact endangered their lives, which may in fact have resulted in their own deportation or death, but they didn't do anything, and perhaps it was in an effort to preserve themselves, perhaps it was an effort because their hands were tied, or what have you. Most of us, I would put myself here too, most of us are onlookers to historical events. We learn through the news, we learn about things that happen. Most of the time, we don't actively do things. I mean, none of us are on a plane to Haiti right now to help out. None of us probably are, I don't know what none of us, but We're not involved in the effort against Darfur. You Onlookers, in some ways, is also an accusatory poem that implicates us. And it's in that regard that it becomes, I think, very uncomfortable. So you Onlookers, whose eyes watched the killing, as one feels a stare at one's back, you feel on your bodies the glances of the dead. How many dying eyes will look at you when you pluck a violet from its hiding place? How many hands be raised in supplication in the twisted martyr-like branches of old oaks? How much memory grows in the blood of the evening sun? Oh, the unsung cradle songs in the night cry of the turtle dove. Many a one might have plucked stars from the sky. Now the old well must do it for them. You onlookers, you who raise no hand in murder, but who did not shake the dust from your longing, you who halted there where dust is changed to light. Now, it's a strange poem in some ways because we try to understand that this is a poem that in many ways it has metaphorical components to it, ones that you probably wouldn't see in Ceylon, and maybe this has something to do with the fact that she herself was arguably an onlooker in some sense, in that she was in Sweden when the events of the Holocaust happened. Now, how she could have intervened, another question. This is a poem, I think, very much accusatory, though, to people who were there. It's like the neighbors, the people who looked as the Jews were put into trains, the people who looked on or perhaps even turned people in. Their eyes watched the killing. It's a sense of the passivity, so to speak, of the general populace as things happened. You who halted there, meaning you didn't actually transform your looking and your perceiving into any action, right? You halted at some moment, in this case, where dust is changed to light. What that means, I mean, it's such a strange moment. You halted at this particular place where dust is changed to light. I don't even know, so to speak, how to unpack the meaning of that. But one of the things I do know about this is there's a sense about survival, about a sense of someone who had the opportunity to do something, but who didn't. And so all that's left now is this sense of feeling the stares of the dead at one's back. You who feel the glances of the dead. Essentially that the dead, how many dying eyes will look at you? Will look at you because you can still pluck a violet from its hiding place, meaning you can still go out to the garden. You can still kind of get on with your life. You can do things. The sense of a kind of accusatoriness of this poem is interesting. And its question to me is, does it accuse all of us? Does it accuse me and you? Does it accuse her? Does it accuse the poet? Does it accuse just the populace? I mean, who, so to speak, who are the you onlookers, right, who are being accused here? But it breaks down the dichotomy between perpetrators and victims. It's not so simple as these are the good guys, these are the bad, these are the guilty, these are the innocent. They're this other group of people, and they're the ones who were neither picking up their hands to do things, but they're also ones who had the knowledge about what was going on and didn't do something. In many ways, it's also the story that Samantha Powers tells about the United States in her book. It's in many ways we Americans as the onlookers to other genocides that have continued to happen from the Armenian genocide all the way up through the present. I mean, it's the perspective that we have of a kind of safety. It's a safety that I would argue is finite and, possibly very short-lived, but it's a safety that we have to be elsewhere, in a different time, in a different place, in a rich country, at UCLA at this moment, and it's a safety that we all participate in. I participate in it as much as you do. In many ways, we're onlookers. And it really, for her, I think the issue is, what's that moral obligation that we have for action? At what moment do we not halt, right? At what moment do we actually do something? Okay, so we'll go with Ceylon's Death Fugue on Thursday, and hopefully you'll have some time to think about it.